I'm not the father. Go have your child alone, Donald Thorne said, his voice colder than the marble floors of his penthouse office. He didn't even glance at the ultrasound image trembling in Benny's hands. 5 years later, the tech construction mogul would stand frozen at the city's most exclusive gala, watching a small boy dismantle a $2,000 centerpiece and rebuild it into something impossibly brilliant. A boy whose mismatched eyes, one blue and one gold, were an exact mirror of the genetic secret Donald had been hiding behind contact lenses his entire life. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Donald Thorne didn't believe in miracles. Not in business, not in people, and certainly not in the idea that someone could look at him and see anything other than dollar signs. But Benny Morrison walked into the crumbling east wing of the Thorne estate like she owned the place, carrying nothing but a worn leather tool bag and an expression that said she'd seen worse disasters than his family's neglected legacy. She wasn't supposed to be remarkable. The contract was straightforward: 6 months, maybe 8 if the restoration proved more complicated than initial assessments suggested. Donald had cycled through 11 contractors in 18 months, each one promising the world and delivering excuses wrapped in budget overruns. Some had been intimidated by the scope. Others had been too distracted by the Thorne name, too eager to schmooze instead of actually fixing the 200-year-old foundation that was literally sinking into the earth. Benny arrived on a gray Tuesday morning wearing work boots that had clearly seen actual work, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and when Donald's estate manager introduced them, she didn't do that thing most people did, that slight widening of the eyes, that shift in posture, that subtle recalibration of behavior that happened when people realized they were in the presence of serious wealth. "Mr. Thorne," she said, extending a hand with a grip that was surprisingly firm. "I've reviewed the architectural surveys you sent over. Your problem isn't just the foundation settling, though that's definitely happening. It's that whoever did your last renovation in the 90s used completely incompatible materials. They basically created a moisture trap between the original stone and the modern waterproofing. The whole eastern wall is rotting from the inside out. Give me 8 weeks and full access to your historical archives. I'll need to see the original blueprints from 1824 to do this properly." Donald had actually paused mid-handshake, caught completely off guard. Most contractors spent the first meeting flattering him, complimenting the estate, talking about what an honor it was to work on such a prestigious property. Benny Morrison looked at his family's ancestral home like it was simply another job. Important, yes, but ultimately just a very complicated puzzle made of stone and mortar. 8 weeks seems optimistic, Donald said carefully. The last team estimated 16 months. The last team was padding their timeline so they could bill you for longer, Benny replied, not unkindly. I don't work that way. 8 weeks for assessment and initial stabilization. After that, I'll give you a realistic timeline for full restoration. But right now, your East Wing has maybe 2 hard winters left before you're looking at a complete structural failure. So we can argue about schedules, or we can get started. She delivered her assessment in 7 weeks and 2 days. The report was 140 pages of detailed analysis, complete with historical research, moisture readings, structural calculations, and a restoration plan that somehow managed to honor the building's heritage while solving problems the original architects couldn't have anticipated in 1824. Donald found himself reading it twice, then calling her in to discuss details that technically weren't part of her initial contract. This section here, he said one afternoon, the two of them standing in what used to be the estate's original library, now stripped down to bare walls and exposed beams. You're suggesting we actually remove the modern supports and return to a traditional stone arch system? Not exactly traditional, Benny said, running her hand along a crumbling beam with the kind of careful attention most people reserved for precious artifacts. I'm suggesting we use the principles of traditional stone arch engineering but with modern materials that won't trap moisture. It'll be stronger than what you have now and authentically period-appropriate in appearance. Best of both worlds. That sounds expensive. It is. But it's also permanent. The cheap fix gets you 5 more years. This gets you 5 more generations. She glanced at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "I assume you care about legacy, Mr. Thorne. Men don't usually spend this much time restoring ancestral estates unless they do." Donald felt something uncomfortable shift in his chest. Most people assumed things about him, about his motivations, his character, his intentions. Benny Morrison simply observed and drew logical conclusions. "My father cared about legacy," Donald heard himself say. He cared about it more than he cared about people. This estate was his obsession. He died thinking buildings were more reliable than human beings. Were they? Benny asked quietly. "I'm still figuring that out." The work continued. Donald found himself spending more time at the estate than his downtown office, ostensibly to oversee the restoration, but really because watching Benny work was fascinating. She moved through the building with absolute confidence, directing her small crew with precise instructions, solving problems in real time with a combination of historical knowledge and practical innovation. When subcontractors pushed back on her methods, she didn't argue or defend. She simply showed them the math, the moisture readings, the historical precedent, and let the evidence speak for itself. "You're wasted on private contracts," Donald told her one evening. They were standing in the newly stabilized East Wing, and the setting sun was streaming through windows that hadn't been properly cleaned in decades, casting everything in amber light. "I want to offer you a permanent position. Director of Historical Restoration for all Thorne properties." Benny was quiet for a long moment, still looking at the window, at the way the light hit the original glass with its period-appropriate imperfections. "I can't accept that," she said finally. "The salary would be substantial." "It's not about money, Mr. Thorne." "Then what is it about?" She turned to face him, and for the first time since they'd met, Donald saw something vulnerable in her expression. "I don't stay in one place very long. I move from project to project, city to city. It's how I work best, with clear beginnings and clear endings. No complications." "You're running from something," Donald said, and it wasn't a question. "Maybe. Or maybe I just learned a long time ago that nothing permanent actually lasts, so why pretend?" Benny's voice was steady, but Donald heard the history beneath it, the disappointments, the lessons learned the hard way. "I appreciate the offer truly. Working here has been different. You actually care about doing things right, not just doing things fast or cheap. That's rare in my world." "Rare in mine too," Donald admitted. They stood there in the amber light, and for just a moment, the billionaire and the restorer were simply two people who understood that some things, some buildings, some moments, were worth preserving even when the foundation was cracked and the timeline was uncertain. What Donald Thorne didn't know, what he couldn't possibly imagine, was that in a few short weeks, everything would change. The walls he'd spent a lifetime building, far stronger than any stone foundation, were about to come crashing down. And the woman standing beside him in the golden light, the woman who fixed broken things for a living, would be the one thing he couldn't repair. But that night, the estate felt almost like a home. But to understand how a brilliant restoration expert and a guarded billionaire ended up at the center of a scandal that would rock both their worlds, you need to know where Donald Thorne came from, and why trust, for him, was the most expensive thing he'd ever been asked to give. The storm arrived without warning, the way pivotal moments often do. Benny had planned to leave by 6, her crew had already packed up for the day, the scaffolding secured against the increasingly aggressive wind. But there was one last structural assessment she wanted to complete in the North Tower, just a quick measurement to confirm her calculations for tomorrow's pour. Donald had offered to wait with her, though neither of them acknowledged that waiting had become their unspoken routine these past few weeks. By the time they realized how bad the weather had turned, the estate's long private drive was already flooded. Tree branches littered the road like broken bones, and the rain was coming down so hard you couldn't see 10 feet in front of you. "I'll call my driver," Donald said, already reaching for his phone. "No signal," Benny replied, checking her own. "Must be the storm." Then the lights went out. The darkness was absolute for just a moment before Donald's phone flashlight clicked on, casting sharp shadows across the stripped-down hallway. "There's a generator," he said, his voice steady despite the circumstances. "But it only powers essential systems. Heat, some lighting in the main residence. I can wait it out in my truck, Benny offered, though the idea of sitting alone in the parking area during what was clearly becoming a serious storm didn't exactly appeal to her. Don't be ridiculous. Donald was already walking toward the main house. There are 12 bedrooms in this place. I think we can manage one night of unexpected company. The library was where they ended up, the one room in the estate that Donald had kept relatively intact during the renovation. He lit candles, actual candles in silver holders that probably cost more than Benny's monthly rent, and the room transformed into something from another century. The fire he built in the massive stone hearth crackled and popped, throwing warm light across leather-bound books and furniture that had witnessed generations of Thorne family secrets. "This is surreal," Benny said, accepting the glass of whiskey he offered. She wasn't much of a drinker, but the storm outside was howling like something alive, and the warmth felt necessary. "My father used to bring business associates here," Donald said, settling into the chair across from her. "He'd pour them expensive scotch and talk about legacy, about building things that outlasted the men who built them. He thought that's what mattered, the permanence of stone and steel and property." There was something in his voice, something raw that Benny hadn't heard before. "You didn't agree?" she asked gently. Donald was quiet for a long moment, watching the flames. "When I was 12, I got sick. Really sick. Complications from what should have been a routine infection, but it damaged things. The doctors told my father I'd likely never have children." He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You know what he said?" He said, "Then you'll have to build something else that lasts. Not, I'm sorry. Not you'll still have a full life. Just redirection to the next strategy." Benny felt her chest tighten. "Donald." "He treated people like assets," Donald continued, and now he was looking at her, really looking at her. "Employees, friends, even family, we were all just pieces on a board. When people disappointed him, he removed them from the equation. No second chances, no room for human error. Just disposal." He set his glass down, and his hands weren't quite steady. "I spent my whole life terrified I'd become him. So I built walls instead. Kept everyone at a professional distance. Easier to manage, harder to hurt." The firelight caught the edges of his face, highlighting the vulnerability he usually kept locked away behind boardroom confidence and billion-dollar deals. "You're not him," Benny said quietly. "How would you know? Because you care about doing things right, even when no one's watching. Because you spent 6 months interviewing contractors until you found someone who wouldn't just take your money and deliver garbage. Because you're sitting here telling me this instead of pretending you don't have scars." She leaned forward. "Your father treated people like disposable assets. You treat buildings like they deserve respect and care. That tells me everything I need to know about who you actually are." Something shifted in Donald's expression, a crack in the armor he'd worn for so long. "What about you?" he asked. "You said nothing permanent lasts. What taught you that?" Benny smiled, but it was the kind of smile that came from surviving things that should have broken her. "I grew up in foster care. 7 different homes before I aged out at 18. Every time I started to feel settled, to feel like maybe this time I'd found something stable, I'd get moved. New family, new rules, new disappointments." She ran her finger along the rim of her glass. "So I stopped trying to build permanent foundations in my life. I build them for other people instead, in stone and mortar, where they can actually last." "That's incredibly lonely," Donald said, and it wasn't pity in his voice. It was recognition. "So is being afraid to trust anyone," Benny countered gently. They sat there in the candlelight, 2 people who'd spent their lives protecting themselves from exactly this kind of moment, and for once, neither of them reached for their usual defenses. The storm raged outside. Inside, something entirely different was building, something that felt dangerous and necessary and terrifyingly real. When Donald reached across the space between them, when Benny took his hand, it wasn't about wealth or contracts or professional boundaries. It was about 2 people who'd been alone for so long they'd forgotten what it felt like to be truly seen. That night, in the library that had witnessed generations of Thorne family history, they wrote a new chapter. One built on honesty, on vulnerability, on the fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, some foundations were strong enough to last. If only they'd known how brutally that hope would be tested. 6 weeks later, Benny stood in Donald's downtown office, and the view from the 42nd floor felt like standing on the edge of a cliff. She'd rehearsed this moment a dozen times during the drive over, how she'd tell him, what words she'd use, how they'd navigate this unexpected turn together. They'd built something real in that library during the storm. She'd felt it. She knew he had too. "I'm pregnant," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. The silence that followed wasn't just quiet, it was the kind of silence that swallows sound, that makes the air feel too thin to breathe. Donald had been reviewing contracts at his massive desk, but now his pen had stopped mid-signature, frozen in the air like time itself had stuttered. He looked up slowly, and Benny watched something in his face transform. The warmth she'd seen by candlelight, the vulnerability he'd shared during the storm, it vanished like someone had flipped a switch. What replaced it was something arctic, something that made her instinctively take a step back. "Say that again," he said, his voice so calm it was terrifying. "I'm pregnant. About 7 weeks, maybe 8. I know this is unexpected, Donald, but I wanted to tell you in person because—" "Unexpected." He stood slowly, deliberately, his movements controlled in a way that reminded Benny of a predator circling prey. That's an interesting word choice for what I'd call strategically planned. The words hit her like cold water. "What are you talking about?" Donald walked to a filing cabinet, his back to her now, and she could see the tension in his shoulders. When he turned back, he was holding a manila folder, and his eyes were the eyes of a complete stranger, cold, calculating, devoid of anything resembling the man who'd held her hand by firelight. "I'm going to show you something, Benny. Medical records from when I was 12 years old." He slapped the folder onto the desk between them with enough force to make her flinch. "See this? Johns Hopkins Medical Center. Dr. Richard Chin, specialist in reproductive medicine. And here, Mayo Clinic, second opinion. And here, a third evaluation from Mount Sinai. Would you like me to read you the conclusion that all 3 doctors reached independently?" Benny's mouth had gone dry. "Donald, patient shows severe testicular damage from bacterial infection. Minimal viable sperm count. Natural conception highly unlikely to impossible." He quoted it from memory, each word precisely enunciated. "Do you know what impossible means, Benny? Doctors can be wrong. 3 separate specialists? At 3 of the best medical institutions in the country? Over the course of 15 years. His voice was rising now, that careful control starting to crack at the edges. "No, doctors aren't wrong about this. But you know who is wrong? Women who think they can trap a billionaire with the oldest con in the goddamn book." The accusation landed like a physical blow, stealing the breath from her lungs. "You think I'm trying to con you? I think you're pregnant, yes. I think the child is real. What I don't think, what I know, is that it's not mine." He picked up his phone, fingers moving with practiced efficiency. "I'm calling security. You have exactly 10 minutes to collect whatever personal items you left at the estate before I have every lock changed and your access credentials revoked." "Donald, please, just listen to me. I'm not the father." Each word was a door slamming shut, final and irrevocable. "Go have your child alone. Find whoever you were actually sleeping with, the site foreman? One of your crew members? Hell, maybe it's multiple candidates and you figured the richest option was worth a shot, and get your child support from them. But you won't get a single cent from me. Not now, not ever." Benny felt something crack inside her chest, anger flooding in to fill the space where hope had been just moments before. "I wasn't sleeping with anyone else. There was no one else. There is no one else. This is your child, Donald. Get out. You're making a terrible mistake. I said get out." His shout echoed off the glass walls, and Benny saw his assistant's head snap up through the office window, watched other employees turn to stare. "And Benny? Since we're being honest now, let me be very clear about something. Consider your career in architectural restoration officially over. I know every major firm from here to Los Angeles, every historical society, every preservation board. By tomorrow morning, They'll all know exactly what kind of scam artist you are. You tried to trap the wrong man, sweetheart. You'll be lucky if you can get work restoring garden sheds after I'm done." The cruelty of it, the calculated, deliberate cruelty, was almost worse than the rejection itself. This was the man his father had raised, Benny realized. This was what happened when fear and wealth and paranoia twisted someone into believing that everyone wanted something from them. She should have cried. Should have begged, maybe. Thrown the medical impossibility back in his face, demanded a paternity test, fought for what she knew was true. But Benny Morrison had survived 7 foster homes and clawed her way up from nothing, and she'd be damned if she'd give Donald Thorne the satisfaction of watching her break in his pristine corner office. "You're right about one thing," she said quietly, gathering what remained of her dignity like armor. "The doctors were wrong about you. But not about your fertility, Donald. They were wrong about your heart. Turns out you don't have one after all." She walked to the door, each step measured and deliberate, refusing to rush even though she could feel his eyes burning into her back. "Goodbye, Mr. Thorne," she said without turning around. "I hope the view from up here is worth it." The elevator ride down 42 floors had never felt longer. And when Benny finally made it to the street, when the cold air hit her face and the noise of the city rushed in to fill the silence, that's when the tears came, hot and furious and heartbroken. But underneath the devastation, something else was growing. Something harder. More resolute. If Donald Thorne wanted her gone, she'd go. But she wouldn't disappear. The eviction notice came 3 weeks later, slipped under her apartment door like a death sentence printed on official letterhead. Benny sat on the floor surrounded by cardboard boxes and the wreckage of a life that had imploded faster than she could have imagined, reading the notice for the 3rd time as if the words might rearrange themselves into something less catastrophic. 60 days to vacate. Except she didn't have 60 days worth of rent money. She barely had $60. Donald hadn't been bluffing about the blacklist. She'd spent the first week after that disastrous meeting calling every contact she had, sending her portfolio to 24 firms, reaching out to colleagues who'd once praised her work. The responses ranged from awkward silence to outright hostility. One particularly cruel email from a firm she'd worked with twice before said simply, "We don't employ people who engage in extortion schemes against industry leaders. Please don't contact us again." Her savings account, once modestly healthy from years of careful budgeting, was hemorrhaging money. Rent she could no longer afford. Utilities. The prenatal vitamins her doctor insisted she take even though she was now choosing between medicine and meals. Her phone bill. Insurance she'd probably have to cancel. The studio apartment she finally found was above Garcia's auto repair in a neighborhood where sirens provided the nighttime soundtrack and the smell of motor oil seeped through the floorboards no matter how many candles she burned. 400 square feet of peeling linoleum and water-stained walls. A bathroom the size of a closet. A kitchenette with a hot plate that worked sporadically if you jiggled the cord just right and said a small prayer. The landlord, a weathered man named Miguel with kind eyes and oil-stained hands, had taken one look at her obviously pregnant belly and the defeat she was trying hard to hide, and offered something unexpected. "The building next door," he'd said, gesturing through the grimy window. 19th century brick, beautiful bones, falling apart. "You fix the facade, I knock 100 off the rent. Cash basis, no paperwork. You interested?" Benny had almost cried from the sheer relief of it. "I do restoration work," she'd managed to say, her voice shaking. "I know," Miguel said gently. "My nephew showed me your portfolio online before all that business. You're good. Real good. Shame what happened." So Benny Morrison, who'd once restored a 200-year-old estate for a billionaire, found herself doing patchwork masonry for cash under the table. She hauled bags of lime and sand up rickety ladders at 7 months pregnant. She mixed mortar in 5-gallon buckets in alleyways. She repointed crumbling brick in the August heat while her back screamed in protest and her swollen ankles throbbed. And she documented all of it. Her phone became her confessional, her witness, her only companion during the long days of manual labor. She'd prop it on a sawhorse or a windowsill and narrate the work, partly to stay focused and partly because talking to the camera was better than talking to herself. The key is matching the original mortar composition, she told her phone, and the 3 people who watched these videos, while mixing another batch. Her hands were raw, nails broken, covered in lime and sand. Modern cement is too hard. It doesn't let the brick breathe, doesn't expand and contract with temperature changes. You've got to respect what came before, even when you're just trying to keep walls from falling down. The irony wasn't lost on her. She couldn't even keep her own life from falling apart. At night, lying in that cramped studio with traffic noise and shouting from the street below and the baby moving restlessly inside her, Benny would stare at the water-stained ceiling and feel the anger at Donald like a second heartbeat. Some nights she'd imagine confronting him, telling him exactly what his paranoia and cruelty had cost them both. Other nights she felt so tired, bone-deep exhausted in a way that transcended physical labor, that she couldn't even muster the energy for anger. Her doctor, a no-nonsense woman at the community clinic, had used words like high-risk pregnancy and elevated stress factors, and strongly suggested she minimize physical exertion, advice that was darkly hilarious when you were climbing scaffolding for grocery money. You need to take it easy, Dr. Patel had said during her last checkup, frowning at Benny's blood pressure readings. I need to eat, Benny had replied. Taking it easy doesn't pay bills. But Benny Morrison had never been particularly good at giving up, even when giving up would have been the rational choice. So she kept mixing mortar, kept climbing ladders that probably violated every safety regulation ever written, kept posting videos that accumulated views in the single digits. She fixed crumbling walls for small business owners who paid cash and didn't ask questions about her past. She learned to stretch $1 until it screamed, to make meals from rice and beans and whatever vegetables were cheapest at the corner market. And when the baby kicked, strong, insistent movements against her ribs that sometimes took her breath away, she'd rest her hand on her belly and whisper promises into the silence of that shabby studio. I don't know who you're going to be yet, little one. But I know this. You'll never doubt that you were wanted. You'll never feel like you have to prove you deserve to exist. And you'll never, ever be told you're impossible. The baby kicked again, harder this time, like an answer. Like a promise returned. Benny allowed herself a small smile in the darkness. Donald Thorne had his empire, his corner office, his certainty. She had this. And somehow, impossible as it seemed, this felt like enough. Labor started at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in late September, 3 weeks early and absolutely, completely alone. Benny woke to pain that felt like her body was tearing itself in half, a contraction so intense it stole her breath and left her gasping in the darkness of her studio apartment. For a confused moment she thought maybe she'd injured herself somehow, pulled something wrong while working. Then another contraction hit, and she understood with startling clarity, this was happening. Ready or not. She had no one to call, no family, no close friends in the city, no partner to time contractions with her and offer reassurance. Just Miguel from downstairs, whose number she'd saved for emergencies, and this definitely qualified. He answered on the 4th ring, voice thick with sleep. Benny? What's wrong? Baby's coming, she managed between breaths. Can you drive me to the hospital? He was at her door in under 3 minutes, still in his pajama pants and an old mechanic's shirt, car keys jangling in his hand. Come on, Mija. Let's get you there safe. The drive to County General was a blur of streetlights and pain, contractions coming faster now, each one a wave that threatened to pull her under. Miguel's ancient pickup truck smelled like transmission fluid and pine air freshener, and Benny focused on those details, the specifics, the small things, to keep from panicking. You're gonna be okay, Miguel kept saying, though his knuckles were white on the steering wheel. You're strong. You got this. Benny just nodded, breathing through another contraction, wishing she felt as confident as he sounded. The labor was brutal in ways she hadn't imagined possible. 18 hours of pain that rewrote her understanding of what a human body could endure. The nurses were kind but overworked, rotating through her room in shifts, checking monitors and offering ice chips and encouragement that felt increasingly hollow as the hours dragged on. You're doing great, one of them said around hour 12, adjusting the fetal monitor. Doesn't feel great, Benny gasped. No, the nurse agreed with a sympathetic smile. It never does. But you're progressing well. Baby's heartbeat is strong. By hour 15, Benny had moved beyond pain into something else entirely. A strange, transcendent state where her body seemed separate from her mind, operating on instinct and determination that had nothing to do with conscious thought. She'd survived foster care, poverty, Donald's betrayal, months of backbreaking work while pregnant. She could survive this too. She had to. Around hour 17, Dr. Patel appeared, scrubbed and ready. Okay, Benny. You're fully dilated. Next contraction, I need you to push. And so she did. She pushed through pain that felt like it would split her apart. Pushed through exhaustion that made her arms shake and her vision blur. Pushed through the loneliness of doing this without a partner, without family, without anyone who'd been with her from the beginning. Then, finally, impossibly, a cry. Small and indignant and absolutely, completely alive. It's a boy, Dr. Patel said, and Benny heard something strange in her voice. The pause. A caught breath. A healthy baby boy. The nurses moved quickly, practiced hands cleaning him, checking him, and Benny was already reaching before she could form words, her arms empty for so long. And now. Here he is, the nurse said softly, placing the tiny bundle on Benny's chest. And the room went absolutely still. Benny looked down at her son, this tiny, perfect creature she'd carried through the worst months of her life, and that's when she saw them. His eyes, blinking open in the harsh fluorescent hospital light. The left eye was sky blue. Brilliant, clear, piercing, the color of a summer morning after rain. The right eye was gold. Not brown, not hazel, genuinely gold. Metallic, almost luminous, catching the overhead lights like polished brass. Complete heterochromia. Benny's breath caught in her throat. She'd seen this before. In a darkened library when Donald had removed his contact lenses, revealing the genetic quirk he kept hidden from the world. One blue eye, one gold. A trait that appeared in less than 1% of the population. A trait that was, according to the articles she'd read late one night, often hereditary. Oh my God, one of the nurses whispered, leaning closer. Look at his eyes. Have you ever seen? Heterochromia, Dr. Patel said quietly. Complete heterochromia iridum. It's rare but harmless. Just makes him distinctive. Distinctive. That was one word for it. Proof was another. Benny stared at her son, at Donald's son, because there could be no doubt now, no question, no room for his paranoid accusations of infidelity. The doctors had been wrong. The specialists at Johns Hopkins and Mayo Clinic and Mount Sinai with their diagnoses and their certainty, they'd all been wrong. Impossible didn't mean impossible. It meant unlikely. And this beautiful, mismatched-eyed boy was living proof of that difference. What's his name? The nurse asked gently, adjusting the blanket around the baby. Leo, Benny whispered, her voice breaking on the single syllable. His name is Leo Morrison. Not Leo Thorne. Never Leo Thorne. She held her son close, felt his tiny heart beating against hers, felt his small hand curl instinctively around her finger, and made a vow in that sterile hospital room with its beeping monitors and fluorescent lights. Donald Thorne would never lay eyes on this child. The man who'd called him impossible, who'd accused Benny of fraud, who'd destroyed her career and thrown her out like trash over his own paranoia. He'd forfeited the right to know this miracle. If Donald couldn't trust her heart when she'd given it to him freely, he didn't deserve to know her son existed. Leo made a small sound, his mismatched eyes drifting closed, impossibly long lashes casting shadows on his cheeks. He looked peaceful, perfect, completely unaware that he was the living proof of his father's catastrophic mistake. "You're mine," Benny whispered, tears streaming down her face. Tears of exhaustion, of vindication, of fierce protective love that felt like it could move mountains. "Just mine. And I'm going to raise you to be a king, Leo. Not because of who your father is, but in spite of it." Outside the hospital window, the sun was rising over the city, painting the sky in shades of gold and blue, the exact colors of her son's extraordinary eyes. Benny kissed Leo's forehead and allowed herself to believe, just for a moment, that maybe impossible things happened for a reason. 4 years passed like a montage. exhausting, relentless, and somehow beautiful in the way that survival often is when you look back on it from a distance. Benny had started The Urban Restorer out of pure desperation initially. A YouTube channel seemed like a logical extension of the video documentation she'd been doing anyway, and if even a handful of people watched, maybe, just maybe, she could monetize it eventually. Generate some income that didn't require her to climb scaffolding or haul 50-pound bags of mortar mix. The early videos were rough. Shot on her phone, propped on buckets and sawhorses, with audio that sometimes got drowned out by traffic noise or Miguel's garage operations below. She filmed herself restoring a local bodega's crumbling facade. Documented the process of salvaging and refinishing discarded furniture she found on the curb. Showed the painstaking work of repairing the broken stained glass window at the community center 3 blocks over, a job that paid almost nothing but resulted in something genuinely beautiful. People think restoration is about making things look new, she told the camera while carefully removing 2 decades of paint from an original Victorian fireplace mantel someone had thrown away. But it's not. It's about revealing what was always there underneath. Respecting the history. Honoring the craftsmanship of the people who built it originally. Leo was 18 months old in that video, napping in a portable playpen just off camera, and if you listen carefully you could hear his soft breathing between Benny's narration. The channel grew slowly at first. 100 subscribers. Then 500. Then 1,000. People seemed to respond to the authenticity of it. A single mother doing real work, no fancy equipment, no corporate sponsorships, just skill and determination and a commitment to bringing forgotten things back to life. But it was Leo who changed everything. By age 3, he'd stopped playing with traditional toys almost entirely. The plastic trucks and stuffed animals Benny bought at thrift stores sat ignored while Leo gravitated toward anything mechanical. He'd disassemble her tools, carefully, methodically, and put them back together with a precision that was genuinely unsettling in someone so young. He built elaborate structures from scrap wood and discarded hardware, creating bridges and towers and interlocking mechanisms that looked like modern art installations. "Mama, this joint is inefficient," he'd announced one morning at age 3.5, examining the corner of a cabinet Benny was repairing. "See? The load bearing is distributed unevenly. You need a cross brace here and here." He was right. Obviously right. And Benny had stared at her toddler with a mixture of pride and something that felt uncomfortably close to fear. Because Leo's brilliance wasn't just advanced for his age, it was the same particular brand of genius she'd seen in Donald. The way his mind worked through structural problems, the precision of his observations, the instinctive understanding of how physical systems functioned. She started including him in the videos. Not as a gimmick, but because he was genuinely helpful and because keeping him occupied during filming was easier than keeping him out of frame. At first it was just small moments. His hands appearing to pass her a tool, his voice asking questions about load-bearing or material composition. Then came the video that changed their lives. Benny was filming a restoration project for a local contractor, repairing the support structure of a 100-year-old front porch that had started to sag dangerously. The contractor, a gruff man named Pete who'd hired Benny because she worked cheap, was skeptical of her proposed solution. "That's not gonna hold," he said, gesturing at the sistering technique Benny was demonstrating. "You need to replace the whole beam." "No, he doesn't," Leo piped up from his spot on the ground, where he'd been drawing in a notebook. He was 4 years old, wearing miniature work boots and a tool belt Benny had made from an old leather purse. "Mama's right. Full replacement would destabilize the original mortise and tenon joints in the columns. See?" He walked over with his notebook, showing a detailed structural diagram he'd drawn. "The load path goes through here. If you sister new lumber along the existing beam, you preserve the original joinery while adding compressive strength. It's actually more stable than replacement because you're not introducing new stress points." The contractor's mouth had fallen open. Benny's camera, still recording, had captured the entire exchange. Pete looked at the notebook, then at Leo, then at Benny. "How old is your kid?" 4, Benny said faintly. 4. Pete squatted down to Leo's level. "Explain that load path thing again." And Leo did. In detail. using terminology that made Pete pull out his own phone to start taking notes. Benny posted the video that night with the title, "When a 4-year-old explains structural engineering to a 30-year professional." She didn't expect much. Her videos usually got a few hundred views, maybe 1,000 if she was lucky. It hit 50,000 views in 2 days. 100,000 by the end of the week. 500,000 within a month. The comments section exploded. People were amazed, charmed, inspired. Contractors started following the channel for Leo's insights. Parents of gifted children found hope in seeing someone like their own kids. Architecture students called him the little professor. News outlets started reaching out for interviews. Suddenly, the urban restorer wasn't just Benny's small documentation project. It was a phenomenon. Sponsorship offers started coming in. Companies that made tools, building materials, safety equipment. She could actually be selective about what work she took. Could afford to move to a slightly bigger apartment, one where Leo had his own bedroom and she didn't have to worry about the smell of motor oil seeping through the floor. "Mama, we have 7,000 new subscribers," Leo announced one evening, checking the channel stats on Benny's laptop with the same casual competence he brought to everything. That's a 12% increase from last week. He was sitting at their small kitchen table, working on a drawing of what appeared to be a pulley system, his mismatched eyes intense with concentration. The gold eye caught the light from the overhead fixture, gleaming like a coin. Benny looked at her son, this impossible, brilliant, beautiful child who'd been called a fraud before he was even born, and felt something fierce and protective surge through her chest. Donald had no idea what he'd lost. No concept of the extraordinary person growing up in a modest apartment above what used to be an auto repair shop. And he never would, if Benny had anything to say about it. "You know what, Leo?" she said, ruffling his hair. "I think we're going to be just fine." Leo looked up at her and smiled, his father's smile, though he'd never know it, and went back to his drawings. They were building something together. Not from wealth or privilege or family legacy, but from scrap wood and salvaged materials and sheer stubborn determination. And it was turning into something magnificent. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday morning, elegant cream-colored cardstock in a heavy envelope with embossed lettering. "You are cordially invited to the Innovators Gala, celebrating excellence in social impact and urban development. Benny Morrison, you have been nominated for the Rising Star Award in Community Architecture." Benny read it 3 times, sitting at her kitchen table while Leo ate cereal and watched educational videos about bridge construction on her tablet. The gala was black tie. Prestigious. The kind of event she'd been blacklisted from for the past 5 years. And it was sponsored by... Her stomach dropped when she saw the logo at the bottom of the invitation, Thorn Industries. "Mama? Why do you look weird?" Leo asked, looking up from his tablet. "I'm not sure we should go to this," Benny said carefully. "Why not? You got nominated. That's good, right?" His mismatched eyes, one blue, one gold, studied her with unsettling perceptiveness. "Is it because of him?" Benny's heart stuttered. "Him who?" "The person you don't talk about. The one who made you sad before I was born." Leo said it matter-of-factly, the way he said everything. "I heard Senor Miguel mention something once about that Thorn bastard when he thought I wasn't listening. Is it the same Thorn from the sponsor logo?" Sometimes Benny forgot exactly how intelligent her son was, how much he observed and remembered and pieced together from fragments of overheard conversations. "Yes," she said quietly. "It's complicated. Does he know about me?" "No. And I'd like to keep it that way." Leo thought about this for a moment, chewing his cereal with the same methodical precision he brought to everything. "But you should go to the gala. You earned that nomination. You've helped rebuild 17 community spaces in 4 years. You've created jobs for local workers. You've preserved historical buildings that would have been demolished. Why should he get to take that away from you?" Out of the mouths of 4-year-olds, Benny thought. "You're right," she said slowly. "But I can't leave you alone, and I can't afford a sitter for a 5-hour event." "So bring me," Leo said simply. "I'll be good. I like buildings and architecture people. And I want to see you get your award." Benny looked at her son, this fierce, brilliant child who was proposing to walk directly into the lion's den, and made a decision that was either brave or spectacularly stupid. "Okay," she said. "We'll go together." The next 2 weeks were a flurry of preparation. Benny couldn't afford to buy an evening gown, so she did what she'd been doing for 5 years. She made do. She found a dress at a consignment shop, elegant black silk that had probably cost a fortune originally but now had a torn hem and a broken zipper. She spent 3 evenings repairing it, her sewing skills rusty but adequate. For Leo, she sewed an entire suit from scratch using a pattern she found online and fabric from the discount textile store. Tiny dress pants, a crisp white shirt, a vest and jacket in deep navy blue. She even found a miniature bow tie at the craft store. "I look very professional," Leo announced, examining himself in the mirror on gala day. And he did, like a tiny business executive, his dark hair neatly combed, his mismatched eyes bright with curiosity. "Remember the rules," Benny said, kneeling down to his level. "Stay close to me. Use your indoor voice. Be polite to everyone. And if anyone asks about your father—" "We don't talk about that," Leo finished. "I know, Mama." The gala was held at the Grand Heritage Hotel, a restored Beaux-Arts building that made even Benny catch her breath when they entered. Crystal chandeliers, marble floors, architectural details that belonged in a museum. The main ballroom was filled with the city's elite, developers, architects, city planners, philanthropists. Everyone dressed in elegant evening wear, holding champagne flutes, networking with the kind of casual confidence that came from belonging in spaces like this. Benny felt immediately out of place, her consignment shop dress suddenly feeling shabby despite her careful repairs. But then she felt Leo's small hand slip into hers, and she straightened her spine. She belonged here. She'd earned this nomination through 5 years of backbreaking work, of rebuilding community spaces brick by brick, of choosing preservation over profit every single time. "Ms. Morrison?" A woman in a sleek red dress approached with a warm smile. "I'm Jennifer Chen from the selection committee. We're so thrilled you could make it. Your work with the urban restorer has been absolutely inspiring." "Thank you," Benny managed, shaking her hand. Jennifer's eyes dropped to Leo. "And who is this handsome young man?" "I'm Leo," he said politely, offering his hand for a very professional handshake. "I'm her structural engineering consultant." Jennifer laughed, delighted. "Of course you are. I've seen your videos. You're even more impressive in person." They mingled. Benny found herself in conversations with people who'd followed her channel, who praised her commitment to community restoration, who wanted to talk about preservation techniques and sustainable urban development. For the first time in 5 years, she felt like a professional again. Like an architect. Like someone with value beyond what she could prove to skeptical employers. Then she saw him. Across the ballroom, emerging from a cluster of executives, was Donald Thorne. He looked exactly the same and completely different all at once. Still impeccably dressed, a tuxedo that probably cost more than Benny's annual rent. Still carrying himself with that particular brand of controlled authority. But there was something in his face that hadn't been there before, something hollowed out around the edges. He looked successful, powerful, and utterly, completely alone. Benny's hand tightened on Leo's. "Is that him?" Leo whispered, following her gaze with unsettling accuracy. "Yes," Benny breathed. "That's him." "He looks sad," Leo observed. "Like Senor Miguel's dog when nobody's home." An announcement crackled through the sound system. "Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. The program will begin shortly with keynote remarks from Donald Thorne, CEO of Thorne Industries." Of course. Of course Donald was giving the keynote. Benny found their assigned table, thankfully near the back, and settled Leo in the seat next to her. Her heart was racing, palms sweating despite the air conditioning. Donald took the stage and the room quieted. He commanded attention without effort, his presence filling the space in a way that made Benny remember exactly why she'd fallen for him in the first place. "Legacy," Donald began, his voice carrying clearly through the excellent acoustics. "It's a word we use often in our industry. We build buildings that will outlast us. Create structures that future generations will inherit. But I've been thinking lately about what legacy really means." Leo was fidgeting with a small mechanical pencil, taking apart and reassembling it with absent focus. Benny tried to pay attention to Donald's speech, tried to look anywhere except at the stage, but her eyes kept drifting back. "My father taught me that buildings were more reliable than people," Donald continued. "That stone and steel would endure when human relationships inevitably failed. For years, I believed him. I built my entire life around that philosophy." There was something in his voice, a crack, barely perceptible, that made Benny's breath catch. And that's when Leo dropped his pencil. It rolled across the floor with a soft clicking sound, coming to rest under the table in front of them. A table with an elaborate centerpiece, some kind of expensive architectural sculpture made of interlocking metal pieces. "I'll get it," Leo whispered, sliding out of his chair before Benny could stop him. Donald had given this speech 100 times in various forms. Legacy. Vision. Building for the future. The words were autopilot now, muscle memory, while his mind drifted elsewhere. A bad habit he'd developed over the past few years, this disconnect between what he was saying and what he was thinking. He was thinking about the estate. About a library filled with candlelight and a woman who'd looked at him like he was worth saving. About a mistake he couldn't undo and a hole in his life that 5 years and $1 billion hadn't managed to fill. "The buildings we create today will shape communities for generations," he said, and the irony of it wasn't lost on him. He'd destroyed more than he'd built lately. Not structures, those were fine, impressive even, but trust. Connection. The possibility of something real. Movement caught his eye. A small figure at a table near the back, crawling under the tablecloth to retrieve something. A child. Someone had brought a child to the gala, which was unusual but not unheard of. Probably some executive's kid, bored and fidgeting through the formal program. Donald continued speaking, but his attention kept drifting to that back table. The child had emerged from under the tablecloth and was now focused on the centerpiece, an expensive commissioned piece, interlocking titanium components that formed an abstract representation of the city skyline. And the kid was taking it apart. Not destructively. Methodically. With the kind of careful precision that suggested understanding rather than chaos. Small hands moving with purpose, removing components, examining connection points, setting pieces aside in an organized pattern. Donald felt his speech momentum falter. We must consider not just the structures themselves, but the human element that. The child had disassembled roughly a third of the centerpiece and was now rebuilding it into something else entirely. The pieces that had formed a static skyline were being reconfigured into what appeared to be, was that a turbine? A working mechanical system with rotating components and what looked like a functional gear train? From a centerpiece. From abstract art. In under 3 minutes. "Excuse me," Donald heard himself say, his prepared speech evaporating. "I apologize, but there's something I need to just one moment." He stepped away from the podium, ignoring the confused murmurs rippling through the audience, and walked toward the back table. His heart was doing something strange in his chest, a rhythm that felt like recognition before his conscious mind had caught up with what he was seeing. The child looked up as Donald approached, and the world stopped. One blue eye. One gold eye. Complete heterochromia, the exact genetic quirk Donald had hidden behind contact lenses his entire life, the trait that appeared in less than 1% of the population, the marker that his genetic specialist had told him was dominantly inherited. The boy couldn't have been more than 4 or 5 years old. Dark hair, intelligent face, small hands still holding a piece of the titanium centerpiece. Wearing a hand-sewn suit that looked expensive from a distance but up close revealed the careful work of someone who knew how to make do with limited resources. And those eyes. Those impossible, unmistakable eyes. Donald's vision tunneled. His breath caught somewhere between his lungs and his throat. The ballroom sounds, conversations, clinking glasses, background music, faded to a distant hum. "That's a very impressive modification," Donald heard himself say, his voice sounding far away. "How did you know the components would fit that way?" The boy studied him with unsettling directness. "The connection points are standardized. Once you understand the tolerances and load vectors, you can reconfigure them into multiple structural arrangements. This creates a more efficient energy transfer than the original static design." 5 years old. Maybe, and talking about load vectors and energy transfer with the casual competence of an engineering graduate student. Donald's knees felt weak. He pulled out the chair next to the boy and sat down heavily, not trusting himself to remain standing. "What's your name?" he asked, and his hands were trembling. "Leo Morrison." Morrison. Not some random guest child then. This was... Donald's eyes snapped to the woman sitting next to the boy, and his entire world completed its collapse. Benny. She looked older, not in a bad way but in the way that hardship ages people, adding depth and resilience to features that used to be softer. Her hair was different, shorter. She was wearing an elegant black dress that he'd bet everything he owned was secondhand and carefully repaired. And she was looking at him with an expression that contained so many layers of emotion he couldn't begin to parse them. Defiance, fear, anger, vindication, and something that might have been sadness. "Benny," he breathed. "Mr. Thorne," she said coolly, "I believe you have a speech to finish." The pieces were assembling in his mind with the same mechanical precision Leo had used on the centerpiece. 5 years ago. The pregnancy. His accusation. The medical records he'd thrown at her like proof of her deception. The certainty, the absolute, unshakable certainty, that she'd been lying. And here was a child. With his eyes. With his mind. Building miniature turbines from abstract art like it was the most natural thing in the world. "How old is he?" Donald asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's not your concern," Benny said, her hand moving protectively to Leo's shoulder. "Mama, should we leave?" Leo asked quietly, still holding the piece of titanium. "He looks upset." "Mama." The word hit Donald like a physical blow. The room had gone completely silent. Donald became peripherally aware that several hundred people were watching this interaction, that he'd abandoned his keynote speech to approach a back table, that his careful professional facade was crumbling in real time in front of the city's elite. He didn't care. 5 years old? He pressed. "He's 5 years old, isn't he?" Benny's jaw tightened. 4.5. "Not that it's any of your business." 4.5. Which meant conception around, exactly when they'd been together. During the storm. During the night he'd let his walls down and believed, just briefly, that maybe his father was wrong about people. "The doctors," Donald said, his mind racing, recalculating everything. "They said it was impossible." "Turns out doctors can be wrong," Benny said, and the edge in her voice could have cut glass. "Funny how that works." Leo was looking between them now, his mismatched eyes, Donald's eyes, taking in the tension with obvious intelligence. "Mama, is this the person who made you sad?" Donald felt something crack in his chest. He looked at Benny, at the evidence of his catastrophic mistake sitting right in front of him, and couldn't find words adequate to the moment. "Yes, sweetheart," Benny said softly to Leo, never taking her eyes off Donald. "This is him." The boy studied Donald with the same analytical focus he'd applied to the centerpiece. "You don't look like a bad person," he said thoughtfully. "But Mama doesn't lie. So maybe you made bad choices." Out of the mouths of children. Donald's vision was blurring. He was vaguely aware that people were starting to whisper, that phones were probably coming out, that this disaster was being documented for posterity. "Benny," he managed. "Please. We need to talk. Please." "We needed to talk 5 years ago," Benny said, standing and gathering her small purse. "You weren't interested in listening then. Come on, Leo. We're leaving." "But Mama, what about your award?" Leo protested. "You earned it. Some things are more important than awards, baby." Donald stood too, his chair scraping loudly in the silent ballroom. "Wait, please wait. He reached out instinctively, then dropped his hand when Benny flinched back. "I was wrong. The doctors were wrong. I was wrong. Please just give me 5 minutes. Just 5 minutes to—" "You had 5 years, Donald," Benny said, and her voice was steady despite the tears gathering in her eyes. 5 years to question your certainty. To wonder if maybe, just maybe, the woman who'd never lied to you wasn't lying about this either. 5 years to do a single internet search on impossible medical diagnoses that turned out to be wrong. You didn't need 5 minutes. You needed one shred of trust. And you didn't have it. She took Leo's hand and started toward the exit. Donald stood frozen, watching them leave, watching his son leave, while hundreds of eyes burned into him and his perfect professional life shattered into pieces as complex and irreparable as the centerpiece Leo had so effortlessly reconfigured. He owned half the skyline, commanded boardrooms, made million-dollar decisions without hesitation. And he just lost the only thing that had ever actually mattered. Donald caught up with them in the hallway outside the ballroom, his polished dress shoes echoing on the marble floors. Benny heard him coming and walked faster, Leo's small hand gripped tightly in hers. "Benny, please," Donald's voice carried down the ornate corridor. "Just stop. Please just stop for 1 minute." She should have kept walking. Should have called for hotel security, gotten to her car, driven back to their modest apartment, and locked this entire nightmare evening away in the box of things she never talked about. Instead, she stopped, turned, let 5 years of suppressed rage finally surface. 1 minute, she said, her voice low and sharp. "That's generous of you. That's 60 seconds more than you gave me when I told you I was carrying your child." Donald looked wrecked. His tie was loosened, his carefully styled hair disheveled where he'd run his hands through it. His eyes, hidden behind those damn contact lenses that concealed what Leo wore openly, were red-rimmed. "I know," he said. "I know I don't deserve even this. But Benny, please, I need to. He's my son. I can see it now. The eyes, the way his mind works, everything. He's my son and I threw you both away because I was terrified and paranoid and—" "Stop," Benny said sharply. Leo was watching this exchange with wide eyes, and she didn't want him hearing this. "Leo, honey, can you go sit on that bench over there? Stay where I can see you, but give us a moment." "Okay, Mama." Leo walked to the indicated bench, though his posture suggested he was absolutely listening to every word despite the distance. Once he was out of immediate earshot, Benny turned back to Donald with all the fury she'd been storing for half a decade. "You want to talk about terrified and paranoid?" she hissed. "Try being 29 years old, pregnant, and homeless because the father of your child decided you were a con artist. Try working construction at 8 months pregnant because you were blacklisted from every legitimate firm. Try giving birth alone in a county hospital at 3 in the morning with no partner, no family, no one except a kind neighbor who drove you there in his pickup truck." Donald's face had gone pale. "Benny, I'm not finished." Her hands were shaking now, years of suppressed emotion pouring out. "Try explaining to your 4-year-old son why he doesn't have a father. Try watching him notice that every other kid at the playground has 2 parents and he has 1. Try being enough, being mother and father and provider and teacher and everything else, while knowing that his actual father is living in a penthouse somewhere, completely oblivious to the extraordinary human being he helped create." "I didn't know," Donald said, and his voice was breaking. "Benny, I swear if I'd known." "You could have known." Benny's voice rose despite her efforts to keep it down. "1 paternity test, Donald. What? That's all it would have taken. But you were so certain, so absolutely convinced that I was lying, that you couldn't even consider the possibility that maybe the doctors were wrong. That maybe medical impossibility and actual impossibility are 2 different things." "I was wrong," Donald said, and now tears were openly streaming down his face. "I was wrong about everything. About you, about the pregnancy, about what mattered. My father spent his whole life teaching me that people were unreliable, that they'd always want something from me, that I couldn't trust anyone. And when you told me you were pregnant, all I could hear was his voice telling me it was a trap. I panicked. I defaulted to the worst possible interpretation because that felt safer than believing in something good that might hurt me." "Well, congratulations," Benny said bitterly. "You hurt yourself worse than I ever could have. And you hurt him." She gestured toward Leo, a child who's done nothing except exist, who's brilliant and kind and curious and deserves so much better than a father who denied he existed before he was even born. Donald followed her gesture, his eyes landing on Leo, and something in his expression shifted, from desperation to something deeper. Reverence, maybe. Wonder mixed with grief. "What's he like?" Donald asked quietly. "Please, Just tell me what he's like." Benny could have refused. Should have refused. But she looked at her son sitting on that bench, swinging his legs and examining the architectural molding on the ceiling with the same intense focus he brought to everything, and something in her softened slightly. "He's extraordinary," she said, her voice losing some of its sharp edge. "He taught himself to read at 3. He can calculate structural loads in his head. He builds things constantly, bridges, machines, systems. He's gentle with animals and curious about everything, and sometimes I forget he's only 4 because he talks like a tiny professor." She paused, then added quietly, "He's everything good about you and none of the broken parts." Donald made a sound that was half laugh, half sob. Does he know about me? He knows he has a father who isn't in the picture. I've never lied to him or told him you were dead. I've just not talked about you. What was I supposed to say? Your father called you impossible and threw us away. I want to fix this, Donald said urgently, taking a step closer. Please, Benny, let me fix this. I'll provide support, financial, everything you need. The best schools, medical care, whatever you want. I'll set up a trust fund. Oh, stop. Benny held up a hand. You think this is about money? You think you can write a check and suddenly be a father? No, I want to help. I want to be involved. I want to know him. You told me to have him alone, Benny said, and each word was deliberate, precise. Those were your exact words, Donald. Go have your child alone. We followed your instructions perfectly. For 4.5 years, we've done just fine without you. Without your money, without your name, without anything from you except the genetic material that gave him those beautiful eyes. He deserves to know his father, Donald said desperately. He deserves a father who wanted him from the beginning, Benny countered. Not one who only showed up after seeing proof he couldn't deny. You don't get credit for finally believing in something you can literally see with your own eyes. Donald looked like she'd struck him. So what are you saying? That I can never, that he'll never. I'm saying you're a stranger to this boy, Donald. A stranger who happens to share some DNA. If you want to be more than that, you don't get to buy your way in or demand rights. You have to earn them. Every single day. For years. Maybe forever. Then let me, Donald said, and there was something raw and genuine in his voice that reminded her painfully of the man she'd known in that library 5 years ago. Please, Benny, let me try. Let me prove that I can be better than my worst moment. I don't deserve it, I know I don't, but please let me try. Benny looked at him, this broken, desperate billionaire who'd destroyed her life and was now begging for a chance to be part of it again, and felt the weight of an impossible decision settling on her shoulders. Mama? Leo's voice came from the bench. Can we go home? I'm tired. In a minute, sweetheart, Benny called back, then turned to Donald. This isn't a negotiation. This isn't a contract or a business deal. And this is a very big if. I consider letting you into Leo's life. It happens on my terms. At my pace. With my rules. You don't get to swoop in and play daddy when it's convenient. You don't get to disrupt his stability because you're suddenly having a crisis of conscience. And you absolutely don't get to hurt him the way you hurt me. I understand, Donald said immediately. Anything. Whatever you need. I don't need anything from you, Benny said. But maybe someday, Leo might. And if that day comes, you'd better be ready to show up as someone worthy of knowing him. Not the Ice King billionaire. Not the man who throws medical records and accusations. But someone real. Someone human. Someone capable of the kind of trust you couldn't give me 5 years ago. Donald nodded, tears still streaming down his face. Where do I start? You start by leaving us alone right now, Benny said. You start by going back to that gala and finishing your speech and acting like you didn't just have your entire world imploded in a hotel hallway. Then, if you're serious about this, you call my lawyer, I'll have her contact information sent to your office, and we work out terms for supervised visits. Slowly, carefully, with Leo's emotional well-being as the only priority that matters. You have a lawyer? I got one the day Leo was born, Benny said. The day I realized I needed to protect him from exactly this kind of situation. Now go. We're done here. She walked back to Leo, took his small hand, and headed toward the exit without looking back. Mama, is he going to be around now? Leo asked quietly as they walked. Maybe, sweetheart. We'll see. How do you feel about that? Leo thought about it with his characteristic seriousness. I think I need more data before forming an opinion. He seems sad. But sad people aren't always good people. No, Benny agreed, pushing through the hotel's heavy front doors into the cool night air. They're not. Behind them, Donald Thorne stood alone in an ornate hallway, surrounded by wealth he'd accumulated and achievements he'd earned and a legacy built on the philosophy that buildings were more reliable than people. And he finally understood what his father had never figured out. You could own the skyline, command boardrooms, build monuments that would outlast civilizations. But none of it meant anything if you lost the only people who made you human. The billionaire sank to his knees on the marble floor and wept for everything he'd thrown away, everything he'd destroyed through fear and pride and the toxic inheritance of a man who'd taught him all the wrong lessons. It would take years to earn even the shadow of a place in Leo's life. Donald had nothing but time, and finally, the willingness to actually do the work. If this story touched your heart, please hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe so you never miss our next story, and drop a comment telling us what you thought of Benny and Leo's journey. Your support means everything to us. See you in the next video.